When Lombardi and his family left New York for good, only he and his son seemed to be really into the move. Vincent Jr. was almost 17, and he was ready to get away from the nuns at his previous school. However, when the family car reached Wisconsin, his son had this to say: "The snow just blew your mind. It was right after a blizzard, and the roads were plowed, but the snow was piled up like I'd never seen it before." Lombardi's daughter Susan also reflected on this, stating she had no idea snow got that big and tall. When we drove around Chicago, everything was fine, and we were up and talking, and then it got real silent in the car when we saw this snow, and my father was trying to do everything to get everybody up again. We were going into a depression here. I'm thinking, where's he taking me? I don't want to do this. It would go on to snow the rest of the afternoon and into the evening. And to show just how much things have changed, they mentioned the specific address of where Lombardi was temporarily living while he was waiting to buy a house. Privacy. What's that? Moving on, it is rather interesting to have seen the paper hyping up George Shaw and talking about drafted QB Randy Duncan. Neither one of them would end up playing for Green Bay though, but you wouldn't have known it at the time. For one, even though Bart Starr had made himself noticed, he was going to be entering his fourth year in the league, and Art Daly mentioned 1958 was supposed to be a good year for him, but it didn't pan out. For example, in the game against Baltimore, while Starr did set a record for both attempts and completions, he also threw 4 interceptions, including the last one that ended up winning the game for Baltimore. Starr was facing an uphill battle, but there would be light at the end of the tunnel. However, for now, he'd have to wait. On February 9th, 1959, the news was that Randy Duncan might not opt to play football at all. Vanese had traveled to speak with Duncan, but apparently the conversation wasn't that productive as Duncan's fate was still up in the air. Duncan's college coach at Iowa actually said he should stick to law and stay out of the NFL. This may sound crazy now, hearing a college football coach say this. However, given the lower salaries of the time period, combined with the risk of injuries and the lower status of the NFL, it becomes somewhat more understandable. On February 10th, it was reported former Giants player Bill Austin would be the Packers' new line coach, leaving just one assistant spot still open from the original 4 empty slots. Austin had played under Lombardi during their time with the Giants from 1954 to 1957, and this move made Austin one of the youngest assistants in the league as he had just turned 30. On Thursday, February 12th, Lombardi held a press conference at the Milwaukee Athletic Club where he addressed the media and got to meet Packers legend Don Hutson. Lombardi gave his thoughts on the off-season issues by stating, "We are looking at game films right now, starting at the end of last season, because the team that finished the season is the one that we'll start with. Joe Francis showed some possibilities. He's a little awkward at ball handling and moving out from under the center, but as you know, he was a single wing back. I haven't formed an opinion yet on the other 2 quarterbacks. We only went through the last 3 games thus far. We're also grading each player on technique, speed, and hustle. The only thing we can't tell from pictures is the hearts the boys have." Lombardi also said they gave their final offer to Duncan and they wouldn't go higher, so they'd have to wait and see if he accepted. On March 2nd, 1959, the Packers held a stockholders meeting at the courthouse where 15 directors were re-elected, and it was reported they had a net profit of $70,106 for 1958. Radio and television revenue generated a total of $95,000 for the team, thus demonstrating if it wasn't for the 2 mediums, the Packers would have been operating at a loss of $24,894. Lombardi, after being introduced at the meeting by Olenichek, had this to say: "I've been hired to do a job without interference, and I don't expect to have any. If you don't like me, well, I don't believe that will happen. A good football team is my number 1 job, and I am keeping that in mind at all times. I cannot make any predictions on the team because I don't know what kind of team I'll have, but I know this much. You will be proud of the team because I will be proud of the team. We have finished grading every player in each of the 12 league games played last year, and we discovered that some players who saw little action have high marks, while some of the other players who we expected would get high marks had lower ratings. I am now holding a clinic with my coaches where we are discussing every phase, step by step, of our offense and the kinds of defenses we can use. Hopes? I am very hopeful we'll win some games next fall, somehow and some way. On February 13th, it was revealed the Packers were to open the season with 4 straight home games. It was expected that 2 of the Packers' 6 home games would be in Milwaukee. The Packers played home games there and in Green Bay from 1933 to 1994 because they wanted to help attract fans from other parts of the state. Although the NFL started in many small cities in the early 1920s, there was a shift to large metropolitan areas. However, the Packers never made that shift, staying in their smaller market, thus putting pressure on them to periodically go to Milwaukee. On March 7th, news was released that Bob Webb has signed a deal with the Packers. Lombardi told the press, "We'll work with him during the non-league season. We also want to get a good look at Starr, Pirelli, and Francis then. Starr and Pirelli will handle a couple of non-league games, and Francis and Webb will get plenty of chances." In regards to his mention of non-league games, I wasn't able to find out what specifically he was referencing, but the concept of NFL teams playing preseason games against teams not in the NFL was something that was done during this time. For example, later that same year on August 5th, the Chicago Cardinals would take on the Toronto Argonauts of the Canadian Football League in an exhibition match, so perhaps Lombardi was mentioning plans on doing something similar. Further down in the article, it discussed Billy Houghton, the 4-time Pro Bowl Packer receiver. He was expected to meet with Lombardi to discuss his future, but instead of continuing with Green Bay, he would later be traded to Cleveland. On Tuesday, March 10th, Lombardi went to a Traffic Club dinner in Riverside. In this photo, we can see Club President Franklin Kent showing off an injury from slipping on ice as Lombardi holds up his leg. One of the added advantages to being the new Packers coach was all the events and dinners he got to attend. There were so many social networking opportunities even before his first season started, although this article notes that this was the first public event he had gone to since late January. At the dinner, Lombardi said this: "We as coaches, an organization, and the team shall play every game to the hilt with every ounce of fiber we have in our bodies." He gave his thoughts on the pro level by stating, "Professional is certainly much more enjoyable and interesting, and this Packers job offers a great challenge to me. I am looking forward with great anticipation to the coming seasons." He addressed the fans by saying he hopes to give you an interesting offense. It will be different from your slot back offense of the past. We will have a split end and a flanking back. Much will depend on the personnel we have available. On March 13th, it discussed the remodeling of the first floor Packers office at 349 South Washington. Some walls were turned down and some new ones were brought up to make things more efficient. One of the new offices would be occupied by Ave Nisi, and Tom Miller, the publicity chief, would be moved upstairs to an office right next to the coaches' offices. As an aside, upstairs is also where movies and coaches' meetings were held. Lombardi himself would have 2 offices of sorts. One would be on the first floor and another room upstairs where he would meet with his assistant coaches Phil Bingston, Brett Cochran, Bill Austin, and the newly hired Norm Hecker, who would coach the defensive backs. Defensive coach Bingston, who had lived in California the previous 18 years, had to make the adjustment to Wisconsin by buying boots, coats, and mittens, as previously being out in California, he didn't really need them. Lombardi visited St. Norbert College to inspect the facilities there, where the Packers held their training camp the previous year. He left having been satisfied with what he saw. The Packers also sent Breezy Reed, the former Packer player and now coaching aide, to the South to scout for players, as he was familiar with the area, having played at the University of Georgia. And Norm Hecker, the new aforementioned assistant, was looking for a house to rent. The paper said that anyone with any such properties could call the Packers office, and that's another thing that's weird to see from a modern viewpoint. An NFL assistant coach is looking for somewhere to live, and the paper tells the reader, Hey, you can help out. March 19th, Iannese was named business manager, having been upgraded from his role as a talent scout for the previous 9 years. Lombardi reiterated that he was no miracle worker and he had no rabbit in his hat, and he declined to predict how well they would do in 1959, but he was optimistic about the changes. On March 26, Lombardi expanded in his philosophy in building up the team. Linebacker is our strongest position. If we do not make any trades, it would mean trading away linebackers. However, we're not trading good football players like our linebackers unless we can get good football players in return to help in other positions. Any trade would be made for the sole purpose of adding good football players. We are interested in draft choices now. And this last statement of not trading for future draft picks demonstrates that Lombardi presumably did his homework. Although it's hard to get inside his head, it would appear as early as March of 1959, he had already followed the college players that would be graduating in 1960, and while he may have liked some, he didn't see any that would be worth trading up for. If this analysis is correct, then this falls in line with his thoughts on Colts quarterback George Shaw. He wasn't going to make the Packers better by simply cleaning house and throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Lombardi continued, "There's no reason why they can't be moved to other positions in our club, offensive guard or defensive end as an example. The ideal is to get the 22 best football players if it means shifting some of those linebackers to other positions. We'll want to see them ourselves before we can feel they can be shifted successfully to another spot. We're shifting Paul Herning to halfback, as you know. That's fine now, but we'll want to see him at that position before we keep him." And while on the subject of linebackers, the biggest one of note was Ray Nitschke, who had joined the Packers in 1958. Although it was noted he would stay away from the team for a while as he was serving time in the Army at Fort Leonard Wood. April 1st. Lombardi said he had now started to turn his attention to the teams he would be playing this year. On the schedule, the only squad he wasn't fully familiar with were the Chicago Bears, whom Lombardi didn't face last year as Chicago wasn't on his former team's schedule. Lombardi said, "We'll make complete charts of the other team's offenses and defenses, and from these we can plan some of our own strategy." April 8th. The Packers' full preseason schedule was released. It would start with them facing the Bears in Milwaukee on Saturday, August 15th. Then on August 23rd, they played the 49ers in San Francisco. And then on August 29th, the Eagles in Portland, Oregon. After that, the Packers would return to St. Norbert College for training camp, then to go against the Giants in Bangor, Maine on September 5th, and the Redskins in Winston-Salem, North Carolina on September 12th, and for their final preseason game, they finished with the Steelers in Minneapolis on September 20th. For the night of April 8th, it was said he would be at the Miller Inn addressing officials and coaches, and on April 9th, he would be at the Press Club Gridiron program. April 14th. After a luncheon at Nina's Valley Inn, Lombardi said 2 major preseason tasks had been completed, which were making copies of a list of the things Lombardi expected from the players and reviewing and grading the Packers' performances in the 1958 season. On that last note, Lombardi said he had reviewed over 15,000 feet of film. Also on April 14th, Lombardi mentioned that talks with Baltimore to get quarterback George Shaw had stopped. Lombardi said that anyone who could deal with the Colts was a better man than him. That would appear to be in reference to the Colts perhaps asking far too much in their negotiations. Lombardi veered away from the subject of Shaw by stating that now, after reviewing the film from last season, he wasn't sure if the Packers quarterbacks were really to blame for the team's terrible performances. Lombardi noted that to be successful, the line needs to be about 85% perfect in blocks, and yet the Packers last year were only around 30 to 40%. Lombardi reflected on this. Sammy Baugh could have thrown behind last year's line. April 24th. Bart Starr and Dan Curry returned their signed contracts. The paper here incorrectly switched their names. Just a year later, as the Packers ascended to the top spot in the West, it would have been unthinkable that the Green Bay Press-Gazette would not be able to properly identify Bart Starr. I'm not necessarily saying the person who made this mistake was unaware of what Starr looked like, It could be simply a case of them not paying attention. However, for early 1959, it could be a possibility. Lombardi had seen Starr play against his former Giants team a few times, which led Lombardi to remark, "He did an outstanding job each time he played against the Giants." Further showing signs of being willing to stick with the quarterbacks he had, rather than trying to engineer some big trade, Lombardi said, "There's nothing wrong with our quarterbacks, but what a little protection won't cure." April 25th, Billy Houghton, the second leading receiver in Packers history behind Don Hutson, was traded away to Cleveland in exchange for Bill Quinlan and Lou Carpenter. April 29th, the administrative operations of the Packers Executive Committee officially shifted to Lombardi, with the committee now only focusing on policymaking, while Lombardi would be in control of the overall operation. Also, as promised, the committee reduced their size from 13 members down to just 7 in order to streamline things. And an interesting note, one of the people removed from the committee was Fred Licht, who had been with the Packers since the mid-1920s. While this was a big step, the paper said that while Curly Lambeau had been the coach, he had also had a lot of control over the organization. However, after he left the team, following the 1949 season, the front office went with a more democratic approach, which resulted in some of the worst years of its history. So it's no surprise they wanted to do something more in line with what had worked in the past. As previously stated, this streamlining plan was actually approved on November 16, 1958, way before they knew Lombardi would be their new coach. So all this power being given to Lombardi would have also been given presumably to anyone else. So when Lombardi told the organization and the press, "I'm in charge here," it wasn't necessarily just a case of him demonstrating dominance, but also a reminder of what the board had promised him. April 30th. With Billy Houghton gone, the Packers returned their passing focus and receiver Max McGee, who actually edged out Houghton to lead all Green Bay receivers in receptions, yards, and touchdowns last year. May 29th. Jim Taylor was re-signed by the Packers, and in the article, Art Daly asked the reader if Taylor will become an all-time fullback. Well, that's exactly what would happen, especially given the standards of the time. After getting limited playing time in 1958, but still impressing the team with his 4.8 yards per carry average, he would hit his stride in 1960, and from that year up to 1964, he would have over 1,000 yards rushing every year. And keep in mind, in 1960, the NFL played 12 games, and in the other seasons, they had 14 games. Of course, it's easy to see Jim Taylor being good in hindsight, but keep in mind when the story came out, he had been in the league for only 1 year, and he had just 247 career yards rushing. But Art Daly, Lombardi, and the Packers saw something in him. He had some fanfare coming out of college as he was the 15th player selected. However, there were only 12 teams back then, which would normally mean every team, including the Packers, passed on him at least once. However, the 1957 draft was a little weird in that in the first round, the Chicago Cardinals, Los Angeles Rams, and San Francisco 49ers all had 2 first-round picks. And although they will all get Pro Bowl caliber players, none of them would be Hall of Famers. Only the Redskins and Steelers, who didn't have first-round picks and chose after the Packers in the second round, could be completely absolved, as they literally had no chance with him as he was selected before the very first picks. And speaking of the 1958 draft, this would be a very special one from Green Bay because in addition to Jim Taylor, the Packers would select Pro Bowl center Dan Curry, Pro Bowl back Dick Christie, Hall of Fame linebacker Ray Nitschke, and Hall of Fame guard Jerry Kramer. All of these players would be added to the Packers before Lombardi came. He had nothing to do with this. However, this same squad that had loads of future Pro Bowlers and quite a bit of future Hall of Famers won only one single game in 1958, but then the very next year, he turned them around into a winning franchise. Lombardi didn't pick out the ingredients, but he did the cooking. June 5th, the Packers signed quarterback Lamar McCann from the Cardinals, who would be competing for a quarterback spot with Joe Francis, Bay Pirelli, and Bart Starr. It was noted that if he made the team, the Packers would have to give the Chicago Cardinals a draft pick. Well, he would make the final cut and get significant playing time in 1959, while Babe Pirelli would go up to the Canadian Football League. June 11th, the Packers officially signed receiver Boyd Dowler after having drafted him shortly before Lombardi came. The paper hyped up not only his ability as a receiver, but also as a kicker and passer, and noted he could fill a void left by the recent departure of receiver Billy Houghton. Although not a Hall of Famer, Dowler would have a solid career with the Packers, especially from 1962 to 1968, where every year except for one, he would record at least 44 receptions. While in modern times, this wouldn't blow anyone away, for that time period that was a solid run, and he would be a reliable role player for the Packers during their 1960s dynasty. Oh, and Lombardi was going to be a speaker at the annual All-American Coaches Clinic. So once again, even before he became a legend with the Packers, he was being given some respect and credit from within the football world. June 20th. Here's something you may not know. When Boyd Dowler originally got to Green Bay, he attended a one-week preseason summer course for Packers quarterbacks to get them familiar with a new playbook. That's right. Before they decided exactly what they were going to do with Dowler, he was sitting in a chair by Bart Starr in a Packers office as Lombardi went over the plays. The classes would start at 9 in the morning and would last a week, and then the players would go home and study the playbook before coming back on July 25th for training camp. Before coming to the NFL, however, Dowler had done some quarterbacking in college, so this move wasn't quite as unusual as it might first sound. June 22nd. Here we can see a photo from one of those classes as Lombardi and the quarterbacks pose together. Dowler can be seen to the right of Bart Starr. From the way this photo was framed, it makes it seem like the class was done in an extremely tiny room where they couldn't even fit any chairs. Of course, that was obviously just a small section of the building, and there would be plenty of space off camera, but it is a funny mental image imagining them doing this whole quarterback clinic in just a closet. During this time, the players would work with Lombardi's entire staff, and they would go over formations, terminology, the passing game, cadence, and some defense. Lombardi would later remark that he was impressed with the intelligence of the group. June 26. The Packers picked up safety Emily Tunnell, who had been with Lombardi during their time with the Giants. Although his best years were behind him, he would end up making the Pro Bowl in 1959. July 7th. Lombardi returned from a vacation at Great Glacier Park, which he took with assistant coaches Phil Bingston, Bill Austin, and Norb Hecker. Red Cochran stayed behind to watch The Office. And Lombardi, after having finished his quarterback sessions with his prospects, reflected on it by stating he was thinking of having Joe Francis as a pass-run option halfback. So he wasn't just thinking of using Hornung for this. He had his eyes on Joe Francis's versatility as well. And Gary Knafleck, the Packers receiver, was looking for 2-bedroom houses or apartments for other players, including Bart Starr. So instead of the front office arranging this, they had one of their players handle it, although it's unclear if this is something Knafleck volunteered to do or if the Green Bay management assigned him this task. July 13th. Tom Ferris, the former Rams receiver, was announced as the new coach for the Green Bay Ends. Ferris would later leave the Packers after 1959 to become an assistant with the Rams before coming back to Green Bay again from 1962 to 1965. Also announced was news that the Packers would take their training headquarters to the Milwaukee area on September 13th prior to the regular season opener so that the squad could still stay together. The St. Norbert College site would not be available then because college would be in season. Instead, they would stay at the Oakton Manor Resort and they would practice at St. John's Military Academy in Delafield. July 18th. An upcoming August 4th event would allow fans to eat with the Green Bay Packers with a buffet-style chicken dinner. The players and coaches would be introduced, and then Lombardi would give a short talk. The article mentioned that fans could sit with the players. I would normally interpret this as fans will be in the same area as a team, but the players would have their own table that only they could eat at. However, this was still the 1950s, so who knows? Things were a lot more accessible then, and if I found evidence of a nobody sitting right next to Bart Starr, That would not be completely unsurprising, but even without security making them leave, the players would naturally want to sit next to each other, and they would probably politely ask the fan to move to another seat. So yeah, if you had a time machine and you went to this event, even without modern overly aggressive security, you would still probably need to avoid getting your hopes up. July 21st, the paper brings up the new L formation. The L in this case referred to Lombardi, as his new offense would be shown off on August 8th in an inter-squad game where fans would have a chance to watch the team play themselves. Now, of course, the L formation nickname didn't catch on. However, what could be demonstrated was a similar offense to the one Lombardi ran when he was with the Giants, and the most prominent play would be the Packers sweep, also known as the Lombardi sweep. So let's take a detailed look at this and see what made it so successful. In this example, we see a variation where is run to the strong side on the right. After the snap, the right guard would pull toward the right, going behind and around the right tackle and tight end, ultimately ending up with the right guard blocking the cornerback. This move by the right guard, however, would leave a critical spot open, and so the center immediately after the snap would fill this hole, blocking the defensive tackle or whomever would be in his place. The left guard would peel around to the right, going around the tight end, and the tight end, instead of being given a specific assignment, would have two options how to block depending on what the defense did. At the same time as this was going on, the quarterback would give the ball off to the halfback, who would run toward the right, and then, depending on how the blocking unfolded, would either run to the inside or to the outside. Lombardi would drill this play into the Packers, making them practice it constantly, demanding almost robotic, mechanical perfection. Although Lombardi didn't use the term muscle memory, this was exactly what he was building up in practice. Players have to not only be in the right place as quickly as possible, but they need to have their bodies in the right position. Being in a slightly different one might mean a slight loss in leverage, making their blocking less effective. This wasn't a case of a coach saying, we're going to run this play 5 times and then move on to the next play, and we'll do that 5 times, and so on. Instead, he took this play and treated it almost like a dance, making them do it over and over and over again. And that demonstrates one of the 3 main reasons why the Packers sweep was so effective. 1. Lombardi drilled it into their muscle memory. 2. The play was flexible, as it gave the running back multiple options. 3. They had future Hall of Fame talent to execute this. And getting to that talent, here was the offensive lineup for that first 1959 season. At left tackle, you had Norm Masters. At left guard, Fuzzy Thurston. At center, Jim Ringo. At right guard, Jerry Kramer. And at right tackle, Forrest Gregg. And at tight end, Gary Knafleck. Further down in the article, Packers assistant coach Red Cochran noted the advantages to having a tight end by stating that before this was used, the slot receiver would have to move all the way to the line in order to block in some running plays, and this would tip off the defense. With a tight end permanently in place, however, you could avoid telegraphing what you were going to do. July 22nd. As training camp was about to start, Lombardi had a few words to say to the media. Although we have a number of weaknesses and depth is a critical problem, the problem is not one that is discouraging. A pretty fair football team will be forthcoming. Secondly, we have to bolster our defense, which I believe we have done with the acquisition of Bill Quinlan. We were hurt pretty bad there with the retirement of Bobby Dillon too. Emlyn Tunnell will help that picture. And we're going to continue to try to help ourselves, particularly at defensive halfback, with trades or otherwise. Those losses hurt too, of course, but I would say, however, that our weakest point at the moment is our offensive guard. The only veteran guard returning is Jerry Kramer, since Jim Salisbury and Hank Bola have retired. We made a deal for Sam Palatella, who would have helped a great deal, but he feels he can't leave California, so he will not be reporting. That situation is subject to change, however, because football players often change their minds about retiring, but it is the weakest offensive position as of this moment. As a side note, Forrest Gregg, as mentioned earlier, would wind up being shifted to guard. Lombardi continued, "The crux of this whole offensive situation is quarterback. Our job is to find a number one quarterback. We have McCann, Starr, Pirelli, Francis, and Webb. We have quite a few. We don't have a speed back either and aren't likely to get one. They're pretty hard to come by, but I think we can get by with what we have in the way of backs. Either Francis or McCann will get a shot at halfback position too. We're strong at linebacker and in the defensive line. They're not the best in the league and far from the worst. Suffice it to say, both departments are good. The offensive end situation is also adequate, and if Skoronski, just coming out of the service, plays some good football, the offensive tackle situation could be fair. And the fullback situation is very good with Jim Taylor, Howie Ferguson, and Luke Carpenter around, and an offensive center, we have one of the best in the league with Jim Ringo." That's all for now. When we continue, we'll discuss the early years of Bart Starr, Paul Hornung, Ray Nitschke, and Jerry Kramer, and then we'll recap the training camp and the 1959 regular season. See you next time.